There is a gun that does not get talked about enough. Not in museums, not in documentaries, not in the long lists of Allied weapons that supposedly changed the course of the Second World War. It gets left out, passed over, treated like an afterthought. And that is a genuine mistake because this weapon terrified the most feared tank crew in history, the men inside the Tiger. The soldiers who sat behind 88mm of high-velocity steel and believed with good reason that almost nothing on the battlefield could touch them. They were right about almost everything. Almost. Because there was one Allied gun that made Tiger commanders nervous. One weapon that forced them to rethink their angles, reconsider their positions, and in some cases, refuse to advance at all. Not because it was the most elegant piece of engineering ever produced. Not because it was compact or modern or built with precision engineering and cutting-edge metallurgy. It was, by most accounts, too big, too heavy, too awkward, and too brutish for the kind of mobile war being fought across Europe and North Africa. The British designers knew this. The crews who fired it knew this. And the German tank men who faced it knew something else entirely. They knew it worked. If you find history like this interesting, if you want to go deep on the weapons and the engineering decisions and the human stories that actually shaped the Second World War, then subscribe. Because we go further than the surface, every single time. Now let us start at the beginning because to understand why this gun mattered, you need to understand what it was up against. By 1942, the Tiger I had become something close to a myth inside its own lifetime. It weighed 56 tons, its front armor was 100mm thick at the hull. The turret face ran to 100mm as well, and sloped or not, that was a number that haunted Allied tank designers because the weapons they had fielded were not built with that kind of steel in mind. The American M4 Sherman, the backbone of Allied armored forces, carried a 75mm gun in its early configuration. Against a Tiger at typical combat ranges, that gun was not solving the problem. The early British Crusaders and Valentines were even less equipped. The Soviet T-34, brilliant in many ways, was only beginning to receive the 85mm gun that gave it a fighting chance. In the meantime, Tiger crews developed a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and you cannot blame them because the math backed it up. Reports came in from North Africa, from the Eastern Front, from Tunisia and Italy and eventually Normandy, stories of Tigers absorbing round after round from multiple directions and continuing to advance. Crews who had knocked out 4, 5, 6, 7 Allied vehicles in a single engagement and driven home without a scratch. The Tiger was not just a tank. It was a psychological weapon. It made Allied commanders cautious. It made infantry units radio back in panic. It made entire battle plans reroute around a handful of steel vehicles that, by any rational calculation, should not have been able to dominate the field the way they did. And Allied engineers knew it. They had known for some time that the gap was widening, that the guns they were issuing to their tankers were falling behind the armor being bolted onto German vehicles. The question was not whether they needed something bigger. The question was what and how fast and at what cost to the doctrines they had already built their entire armored strategy around. The answer Britain reached, after considerable debate and not inconsiderable frustration, was the Ordnance QF 17-pounder. And the moment you say that name to anyone who knows their Second World War history, you get a reaction. Because the 17-pounder was not a compromise, it was not a stopgap, it was not a slightly improved version of what came before, it was an entirely different animal. A gun so capable that that gives it a caliber of 76.2mm, which sounds modest until you understand what the gun was doing with that shell. The barrel was long, very long. 3 meters and more of rifled steel that gave the projectile time to build up velocity before it left the muzzle. And velocity is everything in tank killing. The physics are not complicated in principle. A heavier shell moving faster hits harder. It penetrates deeper. It defeats more armor. The 17-pounder was designed from the ground up to produce muzzle velocities that put it in a completely different category from the weapons that preceded it. With standard armor-piercing ammunition, the muzzle velocity exceeded 900 meters per second. With the later development of armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, known as APDS, that number climbed even further. And when you translate those velocities into penetration figures, the numbers become genuinely impressive, even by the standards of the entire war. At 500 meters with APDS ammunition, the 17-pounder could penetrate over 200 millimeters of steel armor. Let that settle in for a moment. 200 millimeters. The Tiger's front armor was 100 millimeters. The Panther's sloped 60mm glacis, often treated as near impenetrable by lesser guns due to its angle, was not a serious fielded in significant numbers with its 180mm turret front, was not safe from the 17-pounder at combat ranges. This was not a gun that could defeat Tigers under the right conditions at the right angle at close range if you were lucky. This was a gun that could defeat Tigers, full stop. But here is where the story gets complicated, because a gun this capable comes with a price. And the 17-pounder's price was its size. The weapon was enormous. The complete gun assembly, barrel, breech, recoil mechanism, everything was far larger than anything the British had been fitting into their existing tank designs. The Churchill, the Crusader, the Valentine, none of them had turrets large enough to accept it without major redesign. The Cromwell, which would become one of Britain's better medium tanks, had a turret ring that was too small in its original configuration. Even the American Sherman, which Britain was receiving in huge numbers under Lend-Lease, posed significant engineering challenges when designers tried to work out how to get a 17-pounder into the turret. There were people who looked at the gun and said it simply could not be done, that the barrel overhang would throw off the balance, that the recoil forces would stress the hull beyond its design limits, that the turret ring was too small and the internal volume too cramped for a crew to operate the weapon effectively. These were not stupid objections. They were real engineering concerns raised by people who understood the machines they were working with, and they were largely overruled by the reality of what was happening on the battlefield. Because by late 1942 and into 1943, the reports from North Africa were making one thing unmistakably clear. The Allies needed a tank killer, and they needed it before the Tiger became even more of a problem than it already was. The pressure to field the 17-pounder in a mobile platform was not just strategic, it was urgent. And urgency in weapons development tends to produce creative solutions. The first major attempt to get the 17-pounder into a fighting vehicle produced what became known as the Archer. And the Archer is one of the more unusual-looking vehicles to come out of the Second World War for a very specific reason. The gun was mounted pointing backwards, not slightly offset, not at an angle, pointing directly to the rear of the vehicle. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate engineering decision driven by the constraints of the Valentine tank chassis on which the Archer was based. The Valentine was small, it was relatively lightly built, and the 17-pounder was long. There was simply not enough room to mount the gun facing forward with the barrel extending beyond the front of the hull without creating problems that could not be solved in the time available. So the designers did something that sounds bizarre until you think about it carefully. They turned the gun around. The barrel pointed back over the engine deck. The crew aimed and fired while facing to the rear. When the vehicle needed to move, the commander could sit partially outside the vehicle and drive it in what was technically reverse but was functionally forward given the gun's orientation. It was strange, it was awkward, it was not ideal for any standard conception of armored warfare. And it was also genuinely effective as a tank destroyer, particularly in the defensive and ambush roles for which tank destroyers were primarily intended. The Archer entered service in 1944 and was used by British units in Italy and Northwest Europe. Its crews learned its quirks. They learned to set up and hold down positions, engage, and withdraw before return fire could find them. The backwards gun, oddly enough, made this easier in some respects. After firing, the vehicle did not need to turn around to disengage. It simply drove forward, which from the gun's perspective was backwards, and disappeared before the enemy could respond. Tiger commanders who encountered Archers in these conditions found them deeply frustrating. The vehicle appeared, fired, and vanished. The fact that what had just put a round through their front armor was driving away backwards made the whole situation feel slightly surreal. The Archer was useful, but it was not the answer to the real question, which was how to get the 17-pounder into a turret-equipped vehicle capable of fighting in the open with the flexibility that proper tank combat demanded. That question was answered eventually by what became the most important British tank of the war's final years, the Sherman Firefly. And the Firefly story is one of the best examples in military history of what happens when someone refuses to accept the word impossible and instead starts looking for what actually can be done. The problem was well understood. The Sherman's turret was not big enough for the 17-pounder in its standard configuration. The recoil was too violent. The breech was too long. There was not enough room for a loader to work effectively. The turret ring diameter was a constraint that could not be changed without a fundamental redesign of the hull. All of this was known. The conclusion drawn by the official development process was that the Sherman and the 17-pounder were not compatible. And then W.G.K. Mayhew, a technical officer at the School of Tank Technology, and a team of engineers who apparently did not find the official conclusion entirely convincing, started working on it anyway. What they did was not elegant, but it was brilliant in a deeply practical way. They modified the breech of the 17-pounder to allow it to load from the side rather than from the rear. This was a significant departure from the gun's standard configuration and required careful re-engineering of the breech mechanism. But it meant the overall length of the gun plus breech assembly could be reduced enough to fit inside the Sherman turret. They also changed the position of the radio, moving it from the turret into the hull, which freed up space and allowed the turret interior to be reconfigured for the new gun. The turret was modified, the mantlet was redesigned, and additional armor was added in places. The result was a Sherman that looked from a distance almost identical to the standard version, except for the gun, which was unmistakably longer, unmistakably heavier, and unmistakably more dangerous. The Sherman Firefly was approved in January 1944 and production began. By the time of the Normandy landings in June of that year, several hundred had been completed. Not enough to equip every tank troop, but enough to be distributed throughout Allied armored units, typically at a ratio of 1 Firefly to 3 standard Shermans. And when they arrived in Normandy, the German tank crews noticed them immediately. This is one of the underappreciated aspects of the Firefly's impact. The Germans recognized it. They knew what the longer barrel meant. Tiger commanders and Panther commanders who had spent months developing a comfortable relationship with the idea that British and American tanks could not hurt them from standard combat ranges suddenly had to revise that assumption. And they did not revise it calmly. Orders were issued at unit level to prioritize the Firefly as a target. If you saw a troop of Shermans and one of them had a longer gun, you shot that one first, before anything else, before the other Shermans, before any other targets in the area. You eliminated the Firefly because the Firefly was the threat. Some of those orders were captured or recovered after the war, and they are remarkable documents because of what they reveal about the psychological shift the Firefly caused. This was not a weapon that German tankers could dismiss or work around. It was a weapon they had to respect, and respect in armored warfare translates into caution. And caution in a campaign where the offensive momentum was already shifting toward the Allies was a significant tactical concession. Tiger crews that had once been willing to advance into positions they had not fully scouted, confident that the Shermans opposing them could not do decisive damage, now had to ask a different question. Is there a Firefly in that tree line? Is there one in that village? Is there one hull down behind that ridge that I have not spotted yet? The uncertainty was itself a force multiplier for the Allies. Not because every Tiger was now in constant danger, but because the commanders inside those Tigers could no longer be certain they were safe. Michael Whitman is perhaps the most famous individual Tiger commander of the war. His record of kills was extraordinary, and his actions at Villers-Bocage in June 1944 became one of the defining moments of the Normandy campaign. In a single engagement, Whitman's Tiger and a small number of supporting vehicles effectively destroyed a substantial British armored column, inflicting losses that shocked Allied command. It was the kind of engagement that reinforced the Tiger myth and raised serious questions about Allied tank doctrine. But Whitman did not survive the war. He was killed in August 1944, and the precise circumstances of his death remain debated by historians. Multiple claims were made by Allied units, and the evidence is complex enough that no single account has been definitively accepted. But among the claims is one made by Firefly crew from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, who reported engaging and destroying a Tiger during the same action. Whether it was that specific Firefly that killed Whitman is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that a Firefly was present, and that the 17-pounder was fully capable of destroying a Tiger from the ranges involved. The symbolism matters. The most celebrated Tiger commander of the war, killed in a battle where Fireflies were in action. Even if the details remain contested, the broader picture is clear enough. But let us not reduce the 17-pounder's story to a single engagement or a single vehicle. Because the gun had a wider impact than the Firefly alone, and understanding that wider impact requires looking at all the platforms that carried it and all the contexts in which it was used. Beyond the Archer and the Firefly, the 17-pounder eventually made it into a properly designed British tank, the Comet. The Comet was developed in the final years of the war as an attempt to produce a British tank that had been designed from the outset to accommodate a high-velocity gun, rather than being adapted or modified after the fact. But the Comet actually used a slightly modified version of the 17-pounder, sometimes called the 77mm HV, which was adapted specifically for the Comet's turret with a shorter cartridge case, though its ballistic performance was essentially identical to the 17-pounder. The Comet entered service in late 1944 and performed well, offering better protection, better mobility, and better firepower than anything else Britain had fielded in a tank up to that point. It was not in service long enough to have a transformative effect on the European campaign, but it pointed forward to the Centurion, which came even later, and which incorporated all the lessons about what a proper tank capable of defeating late-war German armor actually needed to look like. The Centurion arrived just after the war ended in Europe. It was the weapon the Allies had been working toward all along, and its gun was derived directly from the 17-pounder lineage. There is also the towed anti-tank version to consider because the 17-pounder was not only a vehicle-mounted weapon. In its towed configuration, it served as an anti-tank gun deployed by infantry and artillery units who needed a weapon capable of defeating Tigers and Panthers at realistic engagement ranges. This version had its own set of challenges and its own set of triumphs. The gun was heavy, moving it required dedicated crews and often mechanical assistance. It was not the kind of weapon you repositioned quickly under fire. But in prepared defensive positions, dug in and camouflaged, the towed 17-pounder was a formidable obstacle. German commanders who had learned to push through anti-tank screens equipped with older weapons had to recalibrate their assumptions when 17-pounders were in the line. The penetration numbers at 1,000 meters were still deeply uncomfortable for Tiger crews. Two-sided engagements that should, by the old math, have been resolved in the Tiger's favor were now less predictable. And unpredictability in armored warfare is dangerous. It slows decision-making. It encourages the kind of hesitancy that allows a defender to hold a position long enough to change the outcome of a battle. The ammunition story is worth exploring in more detail as well, because the 17-pounder did not remain static as a weapons system. The early armor-piercing rounds were highly effective, but they were not the end of the development process. The introduction of APDS armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition in 1944 represented a significant leap forward. The concept behind APDS is straightforward but ingenious. Instead of a full-caliber projectile, you take a much smaller, denser sub-caliber penetrator made of tungsten carbide and you encase it in a lightweight sabot, a carrier that fills the bore of the gun. When the round is fired, the sabot accelerates to very high velocity because it is relatively light. As it leaves the barrel, the sabot falls away, and the dense sub-caliber penetrator continues forward at extreme speed. The penetrator is smaller than the gun's caliber, meaning it concentrates all its kinetic energy into a much smaller contact area on the target's armor. The result is dramatically improved penetration at the cost of somewhat reduced damage inside the target, because the smaller projectile carries less material to cause secondary effects after penetration. When the 17-pounder was paired with APDS ammunition, the penetration figures it produced at typical combat ranges were exceeding anything else the Allies had in service. Numbers in the range of 230 to 250 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent at 500 meters. At 1,000 meters, the figures were still remarkably high. Against any German tank deployed in the European theater, this ammunition made the 17-pounder not just competitive but dominant. The only qualification is accuracy. APDS rounds from this period were not perfectly consistent in flight. The discarding sabot could occasionally cause slight instabilities that affected precision at longer ranges. But in the real-world conditions of most armored engagements, where ranges were typically under 1,000 meters and often considerably less, this limitation was rarely decisive. Now let us spend some time on what it was actually like to be in a Firefly, because the numbers and the performance figures only tell part of the story. The human experience of fighting in this vehicle was distinct from anything else in Allied armored service, and it shaped how the weapon was used and how effective it could be. The Firefly's turret was cramped even by the standards of World War II tank interiors, which is saying something. Standard Shermans were not spacious vehicles. The Firefly was tighter. The 17-pounder's breech occupied a significant portion of the turret interior, and the modified loading arrangement meant the loader had to work in a constrained space with a gun that was producing substantial recoil forces with every shot. The muzzle blast was extraordinary. Crew members who served on Fireflies consistently described the noise and concussion of firing as something qualitatively different from the weapons they had trained on previously. After a handful of shots in a short engagement, hearing was significantly degraded. Communication between crew members became harder. Situational awareness, already limited inside a buttoned-up tank, was further reduced by the sensory overload of repeated firing. The rate of fire was also lower than standard Sherman crews were accustomed to. The loading process was more complex. The ammunition was physically heavier. In an environment where the speed of the second shot could be as important as the accuracy of the first, this was a genuine operational constraint. Firefly crews knew they needed to make the first shot count. Then there was the target priority problem, because German orders to engage Fireflies first were not secret for long. Allied tank crews understood that the longer gun made them a priority target for any German armor they engaged. This created a psychological pressure that was unique to Firefly crews. You were the most dangerous vehicle in the troop, and you were also the most targeted vehicle in the troop. Some crews tried to disguise their vehicle's identity by adding fake gun barrels to their standard Shermans to confuse German gunners about which was which. Some used camouflage and positioning to make the Firefly's longer barrel harder to identify at range. There are accounts of crews painting the barrel in a two-tone pattern or adding foliage to break up its distinctive silhouette. These were improvised solutions born from the lived experience of being the thing in the field that the enemy most wanted to destroy. And yet Firefly crews fought with those vehicles through Normandy, through the battles of the Scheldt, through the advance into Germany and across the Rhine. They fought knowing they were priority targets and fought anyway. The casualty rates among Firefly crews were not dramatically different from those of other tank crews, which in itself speaks to the professionalism and tactical skill they developed in managing the special pressures of their situation. One of the most extensively documented engagements involving Fireflies occurred during Operation Goodwood in July 1944. This was the large British armored offensive southeast of Caen that sent hundreds of tanks against heavily defended German positions and encountered fierce resistance from, among other things, Tiger and Panther units operating in and around the Bergabus Ridge. The results of Goodwood were controversial then and remain debated now. British armor suffered substantial losses, and the operation's limited territorial gains prompted criticism of Allied armored tactics and the vulnerability of the Sherman in particular. But within that operation, Firefly engagements provided some of the clearest evidence of what the 17-pounder could do against top-tier German armor. Crews reported engaging Tigers and Panthers at ranges between 500 and 1,200 meters and achieving penetrating hits. Tigers that had absorbed multiple rounds from standard Shermans without penetration were being destroyed by single Firefly shots. The 17-pounder was performing exactly as designed. The problem was not the gun. The problem was the doctrine and the structure of the forces using it. One Firefly and 4 Shermans was not enough when the tactical situation demanded something closer to parity against the German vehicles they were fighting. But that one Firefly was doing everything it was asked to do. The German perspective on the 17-pounder is recorded in a number of sources from the period, including after-action reports, interrogation records of captured officers, and post-war memoirs. The picture that emerges from these sources is consistent. German tank officers who encountered the Firefly in particular treated it as a fundamentally different class of threat from the standard Allied tanks they faced. One captured Panzer officer described Allied tank attacks before and after the appearance of Fireflies in terms that made the distinction clear. Before, a standard German tank formation could engage from the front at typical combat ranges with reasonable confidence. After, there was always the question of where the long-barreled vehicle was, whether it had been identified, whether it was in a position to fire before countermeasures could be taken. The psychological weight of that uncertainty is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Courage is finite. Even the best soldiers and the best equipment are affected by uncertainty about whether their protection is adequate. The 17-pounder introduced that uncertainty into the calculation of every German tank commander who operated in the Western Theater after mid-1944. It is worth comparing the 17-pounder to some of its contemporaries to understand where it fit in the broader landscape of anti-armor weapons technology. The American equivalent in the tank destroyer role was the M36 tank destroyer, armed with a 90mm gun that offered broadly comparable performance to the 17-pounder with standard ammunition. The Soviets were fielding the D5T and later the D10T guns in their tank destroyer and tank variants, with the D10T in particular offering very high penetration values. The Germans themselves, of course, had the 88mm guns in their Tiger I and the various tank destroyer platforms, and the even more powerful 88 in the Tiger II. But among all the weapons fielded by the Western Allies, nothing matched the 17-pounder for anti-armor performance in the period when it was most needed. The American 76mm gun fitted to later model Shermans was useful. It improved the M4's ability to deal with German armor at shorter ranges and from favorable angles, but it was not a 17-pounder. Its penetration figures were noticeably lower. Against a well-angled Tiger from the front, a 76mm Sherman was still not solving the problem. A Firefly was. This distinction made the 17-pounder more than just a better gun. It made it the gun. The specific capability that the Western Allies had that could reach out and reliably destroy what German commanders assumed was protected by impenetrable armor. The production numbers are important context here. By the end of the war in Europe, over 2,000 Sherman Fireflies had been produced. Hundreds of towed 17-pounder guns had been deployed. The Archer had added another several hundred vehicles to the count. This was not a boutique weapon available only to elite units. It was a weapon that had been distributed throughout the British and Commonwealth armored forces, fielded by Canadian regiments, by Polish units, by New Zealand and South African formations that served under British command. The Firefly was present in Italy, in Northwest Europe, and in smaller numbers wherever British armor operated. It was the standard high-penetration asset of the Allied armored troop, and its presence shaped every engagement in which it participated, whether it fired a single shot or simply forced German commanders to maneuver differently because they could not be certain of its position. The 17-pounder had a post-war life as well, which further testifies to how capable it was. It remained in British service through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s in various configurations, including as the armament of the Centurion's early marks before the 20th pounder replaced it. It was used in the Korean War by British Centurions before the transition to newer guns. It served in various Commonwealth armies for years after 1945. The gun that had been developed under pressure to solve an urgent wartime problem turned out to be a weapon advanced enough to remain relevant for a decade after the war that produced it. and the lineage it established, the emphasis on high velocity, high penetration, willingness to accept physical size in exchange for capability, shaped British tank gun development for the generation that followed. There is a specific moment from the Normandy campaign that illustrates the Firefly's impact more vividly than statistics can. In early August 1944, as Allied forces were pressing toward Falaise, British armor was engaged in some of the most intense fighting of the campaign. Tiger units were defending key positions, and the engagements were brutal. One Firefly crew from a Canadian regiment reported an engagement in which they faced two Tigers advancing directly toward their position. Standard doctrine would have suggested extreme caution or withdrawal. Instead, the crew held position. The gunner engaged the lead Tiger at approximately 800 meters front aspect and achieved penetration on the first shot. The Tiger stopped. The second Tiger, observing this, began to reverse. The crew rotated and engaged the second Tiger as it withdrew, scoring hits before it disappeared behind cover. One standard Sherman in the troop had fired repeatedly at the lead Tiger without apparent effect. The Firefly had killed it with a single round. This was not an unusual engagement by the standards of the campaign. It was representative. The 17-pounder did what it was designed to do, and it did it in conditions that would have produced a very different outcome with any other weapon the Allies had available at the time. Let us take a moment to address the critics of the 17-pounder and the Firefly, because there were legitimate criticisms made both during and after the war that deserve honest examination. The first criticism is that one Firefly per troop was not enough. This is true. With a 4-vehicle troop containing 3 standard Shermans and 1 Firefly, the troop had one truly capable vehicle against heavy German armor, and 3 vehicles that remained genuinely vulnerable at typical combat ranges. Critics argued reasonably that the Firefly should have been more widely distributed, ideally replacing the standard gun entirely. The response to this criticism is partly about production capacity, and partly about the timing of the Firefly's development. The modified Sherman was not available in large enough numbers before Normandy to equip entire regiments. The distribution of 1 per troop was a function of what was possible, not what was ideal. As production accelerated through 1944, the ratio improved in some units, but the war ended before anything approaching full Firefly-equipped regiments was achieved. The second criticism is about the Sherman platform itself. The Firefly put an excellent gun in a hull that remained vulnerable. A Tiger that survived the first shot and maneuvered to a flanking position still had options. The Firefly's armor was not dramatically better than a standard Sherman's. The hull sides and rear were vulnerable to the Tiger's 88 at any combat range. The Firefly was not an equal to the Tiger in all dimensions. It was specifically superior in one critical dimension, gun performance, while remaining comparable or inferior in others. But here is the important rebuttal. The purpose of the Firefly was to solve a specific tactical problem. It needed to be able to kill Tigers. It could, everything else was secondary to that requirement. In the context of 1944, with the resources and the time available, the Firefly was an extraordinary achievement precisely because it solved the problem it was designed to solve. The third criticism is about crew ergonomics and usability. As described earlier, the Firefly was cramped, noisy, and physically demanding to operate in sustained combat. The rate of fire was lower. The crew was under additional psychological pressure from being priority targets. Some commanders felt that the Firefly's specific vulnerabilities sometimes outweighed its advantages in certain tactical situations. This criticism is valid but incomplete. Yes, the Firefly was harder to fight from than a standard tank. Every crew that operated it knew that, and they still killed Tigers. They still forced German commanders to change their behavior. They still provided the Allied armored forces with a capability that would otherwise not have existed. The discomfort of the crew is real and worth acknowledging. It does not change the outcome. There is also the question of why it took so long. The Tiger appeared in combat in 1942. The 17-pounder was in development from around the same time, but the Firefly was not available in meaningful numbers until mid-1944. Nearly 2 years elapsed between the appearance of the threat and the widespread fielding of the solution. During those 2 years, Allied tankers fought German heavy armor with weapons that were inadequate to the task. Men died in Shermans and Churchills and Valentines taking hits from German guns, while their own guns failed to penetrate. The delay is a real indictment of parts of the British procurement and development process. It is also a reminder that solving complex engineering problems under wartime pressure is genuinely difficult, and that the teams who eventually delivered the Firefly did so against significant institutional skepticism and genuine engineering constraints. But the delay matters. It cost lives. The 17-pounder was the right answer. It arrived later than it should have. There is a thread in the history of the 17-pounder that does not get enough attention, and that is the role played by the people who refused to accept official conclusions. The engineers who looked at the Sherman and the 17-pounder after being told they were incompatible and said, "Wait, What if we modify the breech? What if we move the radio? What if we redesign the mantlet? These were not senior officers with resources and institutional support. These were technical specialists working on a problem that others had set aside. The solution they found was not a perfect solution. It was a working solution. And a working solution that gets to the battlefield in time beats a perfect solution that arrives too late. The Firefly is in some ways a monument to that principle. It is not the most elegant tank ever built. It is not the cleanest engineering solution anyone could have imagined. It is a vehicle produced by people who looked at what was needed, looked at what was available, and found a way to make the two connect. That kind of problem solving under pressure is not glamorous, but it is essential. And its results in this case were measured in Tigers destroyed, and German commanders made cautious and Allied advances that continued when they might otherwise have stalled. When historians debate the relative contributions of various Allied weapons to the outcome of the Northwest European campaign, they sometimes undervalue the 17-pounder because it is not as immediately dramatic as, say, an air campaign or a major amphibious operation. It did not change the war by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it changed the conditions under which armored combat was conducted in the war's final year. Gave Allied tank commanders something they had lacked for most of the conflict, a weapon they could point at a Tiger from a realistic combat range and reasonably expect to penetrate. That change in the tactical reality produced real operational effects. German heavy tank units that might have conducted aggressive offensive operations became more conservative. The Tiger's greatest advantage, its immunity from Allied anti-tank fire at typical engagement ranges, was stripped away. Not by a piece of diplomacy or a strategic bombing raid, by a long gun on a modified chassis built by engineers who were told it could not be done and decided to try anyway. This is the 17-pounder's legacy, not perfect, not beautiful, not the cleanest solution to the problem, but effective, brutally, decisively effective in exactly the context where it was most needed. A gun that the Germans feared, that the crews who operated it respected, and that history has not yet fully given its due. There is one more layer to this story that is worth taking time on, because it connects the 17-pounder not just to the battles it fought but to the larger question of how you measure the success of a weapons system. The standard measures are straightforward. How many enemy vehicles did it destroy? How many engagements did it win? How did the kill-to-loss ratio compare to alternatives? By these measures, the 17-pounder performs extremely well. Firefly crews throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe record engagements against heavy German armor in which the 17-pounder performed as designed, penetrating where other Allied guns could not, destroying vehicles that had survived hits from everything else on the field. The towed 17-pounders in defensive positions stopped armor that would have overrun positions held with older guns. The Archer, for all its backward-pointing strangeness, ambushed Tigers and Panthers that had assumed they were beyond the reach of tank destroyers. The kill numbers, while not fully disaggregated in surviving records, support the conclusion that this gun was earning its place in the order of battle. But there is a secondary measure that matters just as much, and it is harder to count. How many engagements did not happen because of the 17-pounder's presence? How many Tiger advances were slowed or stopped because the commander, knowing Fireflies were in the area, could not be confident in his vehicle's invulnerability? How many Panther units took longer routes or avoided direct confrontations that they would have pressed with more confidence against an enemy that lacked a comparable anti-armor capability? These questions do not have precise numerical answers, but the evidence that they matter comes from the German sources themselves. The orders to prioritize Firefly targets, the after-action reports noting the new Allied weapons capability, the tactical adjustments documented in German unit histories. These are the footprints of deterrence. The 17-pounder was deterring behavior that the Allies needed to stop, not just destroying vehicles that appeared. And deterrence in combat, the modification of enemy behavior before shots are fired, is often worth as much as the shots that are fired. The gun's reputation preceded it in a way that multiplied its actual numbers. A regiment with 20 Fireflies had 20 vehicles that could kill Tigers. It also had, in the minds of opposing German commanders, the shadow of doubt about where those 20 vehicles were at any given moment and whether they were watching any specific position. The legacy of the 17-pounder extends beyond the war in ways that are worth acknowledging. The lessons of its development, the willingness to accept a large, heavy, mechanically demanding weapon in exchange for genuine armor-defeating performance, influenced British tank design philosophy for the decade that followed. The Centurion, which became one of the most successful and widely exported tanks of the Cold War era, was designed from the outset to carry high-velocity anti-tank guns. Its early 17-pounder armament gave way to the 20-pounder, and then to the famous L7 105mm gun, a weapon that became essentially the standard Western tank gun of the 1960s and 70s. The thinking that produced the 17-pounder, the insistence that gun performance was not something to be compromised in the chase for weight reduction or simpler engineering, runs through all of those subsequent designs. It is a thread connecting a wartime solution to decades of subsequent development. The people who designed the L-7, the gun that went into the M60 and the Leopard 1 and the upgraded Centurion and the Israeli Magach, were working in a tradition established in part by the engineers who refused to accept that a 17-pounder could not fit in a Sherman. The connection is not always explicit, but it is there. There is a Firefly preserved in the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset, and it is worth describing what it looks like in person if you have ever had the chance to stand next to one. Because photographs communicate the gun's length, but they do not fully convey the impression it makes when you see the vehicle whole. The Sherman's hull looks familiar, recognizable, almost ordinary in the context of a museum full of tanks, and then the gun barrel extends, and extends. It extends further than your eye expects. It overhangs the front of the vehicle by a considerable margin. It looks frankly too large for the tank it is mounted on. It looks like a modification, which of course it is. And that visual impression of something improvised, something assembled from parts that were not originally intended to go together, communicates something real about what the Firefly was and how it came to exist. It was not purpose-built. It was not the product of a clean design process that started with requirements and produced a finished vehicle. It was a solution, a response to a problem that was killing people. It was made from what was available, modified by people